Okay, I'd like to begin this interview by sharing with you a statement about your poetry by the Chicano poet Robert Vasquez, and then ask you a follow-up question. I sent him a copy of Pepper Spray, and this is what he wrote. Paul Martinez Pompa's Pepper Spray illustrates how overtly political poetry can be written without any reliance on stereotypical language or placard isms. Rather, Pompa precisely defines the world we far too often turn away from with satiric humor mixed with a polite but firm slap in the face. So I guess my question is, how did you arrive, at least with this strand of your work, to be concerned with political issues? Did it have something to do with things you experienced or things your family experienced?
Yeah, all of the above. A lot of the poems were triggered either directly from personal experiences, or sometimes they become sort of a collage of things that friends or family members have went through. Other times it might be just something that I heard about on the news, on the local news, that might affect the Latino community in particular. And
Did you grow up in a Latino neighborhood in Chicago?
I actually, it's kind of an interesting story. My family is originally from Elgin, which is an area outside of Chicago, which is now has a pretty heavy Mexican population. But we moved away from there and settled in the Gurnee-Waukegan area, which is a suburban area far north of Chicago. And a lot of the poems that I wrote dealt with things that were happening in that area, which isn't technically an urban area. But Chicago, as I'm visiting more cities, I'm seeing how both common some of the things that happen there are, and and unique at the same time, because the suburbs are a very integral part of that particular city, and a lot of the times you see stuff happening out in the suburbs that you don't normally associate as being suburban. I mean, you have the typical strip malls and suburban soccer moms and all of that sort of thing. But while I've lived in a lot of different types of communities, but I went to school primarily in predominantly white schools. So at a pretty young age, I was aware of my otherness, and that probably laid the groundwork for my politicization. You know, I very early on was aware that of racial issues and cultural issues that maybe some other persons who grew up exclusively in an all-Latino neighborhood or an all-Mexican neighborhood might not have had to face in an intense of a way as I might have been introduced to.
I'd never thought about it that way. That in fact, by growing up in a neighborhood where you were the only Chicano or Mexican, or in a school, that actually made you think about the contrast more. Who have been, getting back to this idea of political poetry for now, who have been some of the models that you've looked to when trying to see how you're going to approach this type of material?
The first book of poetry that I ever bought on my own, not for a class or anything, that I actually bought from a bookstore. I remember buying the book. It wasn't really that many years ago. It was a book by Ana Castillo, and it was in a bookstore on the south side of Chicago. A very cool little bookstore called, it is called the 57th Street Books. It's part of a seminary co-op bookstore. It's part of the University of Chicago. And I remember immediately being drawn to her work because it just spoke to me. For one, I really was excited that here was a Chicano poet from Chicago who was representing, so to speak, was holding it down. And
did you know her work or of her before you bought the book?
I had only heard of her through a peer of mine at the University of Chicago who was from California, and he was very political. He was very involved with political movements out there, and he ended up transferring to Chicago. So he had very much a Califas thing going on. And I had heard of Sandra Cisneros and the more popular people, but he said, hey, you should check out this Ana Castillo person.
And it was poetry.
Pardon me?
It was a book of poetry by her.
Yeah.
Do you remember what book it was?
My father was a Toltec, so
Okay.
it was her collection, her selected poems, and like I said, immediately it really blew me away. And when I look back now on those poems, they always kind of have that little special place in my heart for me. But
who were some of your other models? So that was an early model as far as...
It was an early model.
Yeah.
Well, when I went away to get my Master of Fine Arts degree, and when I started creative writing more formally, I started being introduced to a lot of poets. I feel like I came to poetry through the back door. I didn't grow up with a notebook jotting down little poems. I was not a big reader when I was young. That was my worst subject. I was more interested in...
English was not your best subject?
No, not at all. And but ironically, that's what I ended up majoring in and studying. And so when I was at Indiana University pursuing an MFA, there were all these poets who had all these different, my peers had all these different poets that they were reading, and they were turning me on to. So I was kind of, which actually ended up leaving big, huge gaps in my reading. Like I probably shouldn't admit to this, but I've been told that my work resembles somewhat Mona de Cervantes.
Uh-huh.
And at the most recent AWP in Austin, I was at the book fair, and I bought one of her books, and Eduardo Corral was kind of giving me a hard time. He's like, man, you should be ashamed of yourself. You don't have the... I had never read her work before. I knew who she was, but I had never actually read her before. But maybe indirectly, I was reading people who were influenced by her. So maybe indirectly, I was reading her. But
when did you? Because when I started reading your work, I immediately thought of writers like Martinez Pompa on the one hand. I thought of Luis Rodriguez on the other. When did you read them, or have you read them? Was it while you were at IU Bloomington, while you were at Chicago? When did those two particular poets
I actually
get on your radar?
I think I found Martinez Pompa between the time that I was an undergrad and when I went to Indiana, and he is another poet that very much so spoke to me, and to some extent he has several poems where I read it and I wish that I had written those poems. I just love, but then I have some other influences. I had the fortune or the privilege of studying under David Woljan at the University of Chicago.
Oh, he was at Chicago.
He was a visiting professor when I was in my last year there. And I didn't know who he was. I didn't know anything about that. I just knew that I wanted to do a poetry project for my BA thesis. I wanted to write a cycle of poems because he had the option to do that if he wanted to. And I was told to go towards him in his direction, and he was very modest and very humble. He never said, you should read my stuff, if you really want to see some good poetry. But eventually I did pick up one of his books, and I was blown away again. So even though to some extent we might be coming from different backgrounds, maybe what we had in common was there's sort of a working class vibe going through his work, and maybe that's what I was drawn to. But
did he turn you on to certain writers himself?
He told me, it was an interesting experience being there, because as a Latino poet, I think there are some Latino poets that don't have as much cultural capital as others, and some are considered lowbrow. I remember him telling me, don't get me wrong, I think he's great and all, but I also had to hear some kind of not so good things. Like he said something like, if you're going to read the Latino poets, then don't waste your time reading all these crappy ones, read the good ones. And he was telling me, read Vallejo and Neruda and Latin American poets, not Latino poets. Although he did turn me on to Pat Mora, who I like very much, and Gary Soto. I hadn't really read his work until then. So
he recommended Pat Mora and Gary Soto.
Yeah.
You don't have to say who he was referring to.
Yeah.
But did he also had opinions about some of the other poets who he didn't feel were as good?
Right.
At that point, had you read any Latino poets besides Ana Castillo and Martín Espada when you were studying with David Wojan?
Very few. I remember when I was in high school, in the library, in our high school library, there was a little small orange collection called, I think it was called Mexican American Voices. And there were several, it was a collection of poetry, short fiction. I believe there was a play in the back. It had a piece by, with a pistol in his hand, Gregorio Cortez, I believe is his name.
Yeah.
I can't remember.
Sure.
I'm drawing a blank now. But anyway, I stole it from the high school, and but it was very.
Americo Paredes, I think.
Yes, that's it.
Americo
He's the one that
Paredes.
edited it. Yeah.
Yeah.
It felt. It just didn't quite speak to what I was feeling, and with regards to my relationship with my heritage and what I was seeing around me.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually ended up being drawn more towards African American writers because I just couldn't find any Latino because I didn't know.
Yeah.
Who they were, so I found.
What years would this have been when you
When I first started, probably towards the end of high school, and as I started getting in, when I went to college.
This would have been in the early 90s? When would this have been?
Yeah, early 90s. I didn't even know, like I said, when I went to the University of Chicago and met other Latino persons there, those were the people who started turning me on to all these different Latino writers. It wasn't my professors or my teachers because they didn't know of any. I didn't know.
But David Wojan was an exception.
Yeah, he was an exception. He's sort of like a walking encyclopedia.
What about someone like Luis Rodriguez, who, as you know, made his home in Chicago for many years and founded the Achucha Press? Did his time in Chicago coincide with when you were in Chicago? Do you remember anything about him?
Yeah, he as far as when I was writing seriously, I think he had already moved on to California.
Okay.
So I never got to meet him personally, but he is another person that I started reading actually after I got out of college, when I was, again, when I was between my undergrad and my graduate programs. That's when I started getting more, being exposed more to different Latino poets, and he...
Did you do the MFA right after Chicago?
No, I took a couple of years off, and then I went down to Indiana, followed David Wojan down there, because he's gone now, but he was the director of that program at the time, and so I wanted to continue studying under him. So.
Okay. Shifting gears a little bit, one of the things that I find attractive about pepper spray is that you cultivate different types of lines and stanzas. On the one hand, in poems like Night and Bones, you use the whole field of the page to score your lines. And then in poems like Want and Night Shift, you deploy fairly straightforward symmetrical stanzas. And then you also have a number of prose poems, among them Exclamation Point. Could you talk a little bit about how you developed your sense of the line and the stanza, and any other questions relating to how you deploy words on the page?
When I first started writing poetry, I was writing very, if there is such a thing as super uber free form poetry, I wasn't thinking about the line at all. Because I didn't know any better. But I started really thinking about it probably when I went to Indiana, and that's when I got turned on. I was in a writing workshop with Kevin Young, and he turned us on to Charles Olson, Robert Creeley, the Black Mountain poets, and he got us thinking more about the line. As he talks about it, it's a unit in and of itself, and it's like talks about how the breadth of the line, and I really it's a visual thing. Actually, largely for me, as I've developed as a writer, I'm noticing that even as a reader, I'm more drawn to poems that have a very tight line, that are in couplets or even quatrains and aren't very long, versus ones that are sort of all over the place.
And yet you mentioned Olson, and when I hear the name Olson, I think of field poetics and lines having very irregular shapes on the page. So can you comment on?
Yeah, I think, well, maybe more so Creeley than as far as the actual line itself, because he writes these really tight,
Yeah.
small, little compact poems, which, again, I think it might speak to, I have a short attention span myself, and so I feel it's asking a lot of the reader. For me, well, first of all, I get a little anxious about any time a poem of mine spills on past one page for whatever reason, because I feel that break in attention upsets the flow of the poem in a way that I haven't been able to reconcile, or figure out yet. And
So Creeley, you think, was more of an influence than Charles Olson, to take two examples?
yeah. I guess when I mention Olson primarily just because of the correspondences that the two had together, and sort of reading them, and those getting me thinking about poetry or craft, I guess, in a more intense way than before.
So you've said something very interesting. So here you are at Indiana, Bloomington, and you have Kevin Young, an African-American poet, turning you on to the Black Mountain School.
Mm-hmm.
Were there any other poets during your development who turned you on to certain schools, other the New York School, the Beats? How did you discover some of the other?
Probably, actually, just through talking to Kevin Young, he probably had the most significant impact on, as far as introducing me to new readers. A lot of what happened the rest of my time at Indiana it was another kind of isolating experience. Not to, I guess I'm answering the question in a roundabout way, but like I had told you, I'd went to a high school where I was one of the few persons of color. Then I went to community college where it was different. There was a lot more diversity there. But then I transferred to the University of Chicago, where yet again I was one of the few, and there was they would probably consider themselves to be a liberal, progressive school. Chicago, but I find that people who refer to themselves in that way often, there are still certain things that they haven't resolved or thought about, and so I ended up butting heads a lot with people there. And then I went down to Indiana, and it was the same thing all over again. So by that point, that's, I think, what helped develop this kind of, the quote you read said something about a slap in the face.
Mm-hmm.
It was more a reaction to just being in workshops where I felt that I was being misread, and so rather than leaving or quitting it or saying the hell with it, I just started playing with it, and reacting to it.
So when you're
on
talking
the
about
page,
these experiences of maybe feeling a little isolated or misunderstood, you're talking about writing workshops in Chicago and in Bloomington.
Yeah, writing workshops. So
What about, you mentioned community college. Did you have any creative writing courses at the community college level?
I did take one. It was an intro to creative writing class. Actually, it was my first semester in college period that I took. And at that point, I think I was just kind of feeling my way around, because I had already known that I had declared an English major, and so I was always kind of interested in that, in creative writing, but I'd never really done it or been experienced to it, had any experience with it. And I don't have any strong memories from that class other than it was positive. The teacher was pretty much appreciative of anything that you were doing. He wasn't a real hard ass or anything. He was very had a lot of praise, and I wrote a lot of horrible work.
So was there a moment while you were at the University of Chicago, or was this moment in that 2-year period after you were at the University of Chicago where you said, I want to pursue poetry seriously, and in order to do that, I'm going to get a graduate degree and study with David Wojan? Did that moment, if that moment existed, take place in Chicago or after Chicago? Can you tell us about that moment?
It was my senior year in Chicago, and Chicago is very much a theory-oriented school. It's very intellectually rigorous. You crank out essay after essay after essay after essay, and after just really being just drained from that, in your senior year, you have the option to do a BA thesis. Most people there at Chicago do the essay option, and very few do the creative option. And I started writing. I wrote this poem for a cultural show when I was. It's my final year at Chicago, and it was very much you know, it was a free verse poem meant to be performed, and just in writing that and working with it, I found this new sort of outlet that seemed like that there were no boundaries. It just seemed like it was like I could do anything in this genre. And I still feel that way. That's what I really like about poetry, and so that's when I decided to pursue the BA thesis. I got hooked up with Wojan, and I didn't know what an MFA was at all. I didn't know that you could, So I had asked him about it. He's the one who told me there are MFA programs. He named a few and kind of took me under his wing a little bit, and
Mm-hmm.
directed me in the right to the right place.
So in that sense, then, Chicago has been a very important place for you, aside from
Mhm.
growing up there,
Mhm.
but also in your education. In reading Pepper Spray, it's very clear that Chicago is an indelible presence. Would you say that you are a poet of the city, or would that be an oversimplification? Have you spent some time in Bloomington, Indiana? Have you written poems that are set in Indiana? How would you describe your poetics vis-a-vis urban or non-urban?
I don't see myself as an urban poet, although I definitely can see how someone would read Pepper Spray and think, oh yeah, this is the city. These are all happy. When I wrote a lot of the poems that were in there, I think there's really only two that I can think of off the top of my head that I actually perceive as happening in Chicago. Whereas, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the stuff is stuff that actually things that happen outside of Chicago.
In the suburbs.
In the suburban area. Although I wouldn't take offense to someone saying you're an urban poet, which I suppose is a kind of boxing someone in. But, I did write a few poems about, I guess, that were located in Bloomington when I was there. It wasn't a very happy time for me when I was in Bloomington. I had the attitude of, I'm here to hone my craft, write some poems, and then get out. I wouldn't.
So, is it the case then that you were in Bloomington writing about Chicago and the suburbs of Chicago?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, Chicago
Bloomington
area.
just happened to be the place where you were writing,
Mm-hmm.
but your subject matter was elsewhere.
Right.
So you had this distance.
Mm-hmm.
Now you're back in Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
So can you talk a little bit about what it was like to be writing about something being absent from it?
Yeah, it's the normal cliche, I guess, of a writer having to leave their homeland to be able to write about it, and it definitely gives you a new kind of lens when you return. And it was interesting because every time I would leave, I would go home quite a bit. My family's in the Chicago area, and I'm very close to my family, so I would always go home to visit them. Then when I would leave, as soon as I would get, say, past the outskirts, when you get into Indiana, rural Indiana, I would go through a culture shock, especially when I get into Bloomington. And I would always tell myself, I can't believe I actually live here. I just don't feel like this is my scene. I feel out of place here. But then after a few weeks, I would kind of acclimate, and then I would go back to Chicago, and then I would get the reverse thing would happen. I would just be like, oh wow, I'm missing all this stuff, and it definitely, I noticed. A lot of times people talk about the Midwest as this big, homogenous thing, but I think that Chicago was definitely a distinctive. I don't feel it's the same as other Midwestern cities. It just feels different. There's a different vibe happening in Chicago versus Bloomington, and that might seem obvious because it's a big urban center, but it just feels different. But it still had very much, I think, has its feet on the ground, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
It's not pretentious like New York, or how I perceive New York to be.
Okay.
It has its working class roots, and I don't know. Keeps you down to earth to stay in Chicago.
I want to get back for a moment to the comment that David Wojan made to you when he said, if you're going to read Latino poets, read the good ones. You mentioned Cesar Vallejo, or he mentioned Cesar Vallejo. Neruda, as you
Neruda.
mentioned. Neruda. Do you remember anyone else you mentioned in that vein?
Those were the two ones
That you
that
mentioned.
because he himself is a huge um, reader and fan of those two poets. So
Okay.
he really was into the modernist poets. So he was
So,
pushing those.
did you take his advice? Had you heard of Neruda and Vallejo before?
I had heard of Neruda. I had never heard of Viejo at that point, although I'd never read Neruda. So I think I checked out the selected by both of them, and it didn't immediately speak to me in the way that Pat Morra did, and even Gary Soto to an extent, and Ana Castillo. Um, now though, I can appreciate their work a little bit more.
Did you read them in translation?
Yes, although I had a version where it had the English on one page and the Spanish on the other, so I could kind of go back and forth a little bit. My Spanish reading isn't that good, but I would try and see just how it was translated to see any differences that might have occurred.
You mentioned Pat Morra, and Pat Morra, from what I've read of hers, seems to be a poet where Spanish does have a significant role, at least in the poetry of hers that I've read. Could you talk a little bit about what your relationship with the Spanish language is with regard to you as a poet, both as a writer and a reader?
My Spanish is okay. I've studied it not very intensely. I took a class or two in high school, and I took a couple of classes in college. I grew up speaking primarily English. Spanish was always the language of the abuelos, like my grandparents. I didn't speak it a whole lot, so I think to some extent when I started writing poetry, I didn't feel qualified. I didn't feel like it belonged to me. I didn't. If I was gonna, my grandmother would say things like, if you're not gonna speak it right, then don't speak it at all. So I kind of veered away from it. But now, I see that as something. It's very limiting. I can only write in English. Then that means that's a lot of stuff that I can't do. However, I kind of look at it like that. I don't feel that I write about a lot of ugly things, I feel, and for whatever, this is where I think the English language is a very ugly language. It's very harsh. The consonant sounds are very harsh, whereas I view Spanish as it's very pretty, it's very beautiful, and I feel one of the things that troubles me as a poet, one of the struggles that I go through is whether or not it's appropriate to write about some of the things I do. Am I doing it justice, or am I just pimping out someone else's horrible experience? And I feel that by writing in Spanish, it makes it too beautiful. Like if you write about, I don't know.
Is it possible? I guess when I asked the question, I was thinking more as a reader than a writer. But I'm going to comment on what you just said about Spanish. Is it possible that someone who's a native Spanish speaker from Mexico or Chile or Argentina might think that you might be romanticizing Spanish a little bit by saying that Spanish is beautiful, and because my subject matter is a little bit unbeautiful, then Spanish wouldn't fit. I'm just wondering what.
Yeah, it could be that I'm doing that, and also, but on the other hand, there's a part of me that likes the idea of the tension created in using what I perceive to be a beautiful form to talk about ugly things. And but overall, at the end of the day, the bottom line is that it's not a tool that I am good at. I just
guess I was
can't do
thinking
it.
more in terms of not so much that you're going to all of a sudden reclaim the language of your ancestors and start writing in it. I guess I was thinking more, and this is what I was getting at when I asked you about Neruda and Vallejo as a reader more than anything else, or even translation. Have you ever dabbled or thought about translating, getting a reading knowledge of Spanish and engaging the language as a reader, and then maybe rendering some stuff from Spanish into English?
I submitted a couple of poems to this small journal, and the editor of that journal saw my last name. The poems weren't necessarily about Mexican culture per se, There was a poem about dealing with, I guess maybe what might be deemed an urban issue. It dealt with the police.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote me back saying, I'll accept this poem as long as you translate it into Spanish. So there was the immediate assumption that I could do that in the first place, and the other one that there's something Mexican about this experience, that it needs to be told in Spanish. So I hadn't published in many journals, and so I was like, okay, so I actually did, and I sent it back to him.
Into Spanish?
Into Spanish.
How was that?
It was
It sounds like it would have been difficult.
Yeah, it was difficult, but it was actually a very eye-opening experience, and I don't know why I haven't gone back to trying more of that, but because it just made you rethink every word choice a lot more intensely when you try to translate it versus your diction versus if you're just working in one language alone. That's why, I mean, you talk about the idea of elaborating.
Yeah.
In a poem, you don't use translation, which is very much, there's always stuff lost in translation, but...
Have you done any translating from Spanish into English?
No, I haven't.
Uh-huh.
Not at all.
Which I would think would be, I mean, I know from my experience, that's easier and more natural than English into Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, could you talk a little bit about your method of work and revision and what works for you? Do you carry around a notebook? Do you write every day? Do you wait for inspiration? What secrets might you be willing to share with us today?
I used to carry around a little notebook, and I have one, although it doesn't go with me as much as it used to. Often, when I get an idea for a poem, it's right when I'm in bed about to fall asleep, and then my mind is sort of racing and something will pop into my head. And a lot of times I'm too lazy to go and write it down. So actually this happened last night. I got an idea for a poem, and so what I did is I had a little book on the dresser or the nightstand, the hamper thing next to me. So I took it and I threw it on the floor because I knew that would remind myself. That's what I do. I throw stuff on the floor because I'm anal. I don't like stuff on the floor. So I do that so that when I wake up in the morning, I would remember that, oh yeah, I had that thought. Now I need to go write it down. So that's normally
one of your methods. But what if you forget though?
Well, normally it's just like a line or an image.
Okay.
And then I write that when I actually go to sit down. I'll write it down, and then I have I don't know if you'd call it a database, but this huge document full of just these little images. And then when I sit down to write, if I'm ever stuck, I'll go to it and I'll use it to see if I can riff off of it and turn it into something, into a poem or something like that. So,
how does revision work for you?
I revise a lot. I have poems that first began years ago that get put away and I come back to them. Very rarely does a poem come out on the first try. I think I can think of 2 poems where I was able to finish it in like a day, where it just came out. And on the other hand, though, there's the side of me that is concerned about over-revising, about doing it to the point that you lose something, which is a problem that I'm having with the poem that I'm working on right now, that I've been working on it for a long time. Like, I'm wondering, and I save all of the revisions, like I always have, so the document gets longer and longer and longer, and then sometimes I go and look and see where did I actually start off with this poem. And
you sound very methodical.
Yeah, I guess I am.
So you keep all your versions?
Oh yeah, I keep them all because I don't want to lose anything, even if it's the most horrible thing.
So literary scholars are going to have a field day with your work someday. And I'm sorry, I interrupted.
Hopefully.
So we were talking about revision.
Yeah, and another good thing that I got out of Indiana and the workshops was the idea of not being wedded to your lines. Like if you have this really great line in a poem and you're like, I can't take this line out, this line is the line of the poem, but it might very well be that that's the line that's screwing the whole poem up. So I look at it, I recycle a lot. I might take that line out, put it aside, save it somewhere, and then this poem will turn into its own thing, and then later on I'll be able to use this line to turn it into a completely different poem. So that happens a lot.
How do you decide if a poem is going to be in lines or a block of prose? You talked about being attracted to the sort of Creeley-like stanza and then you have the poems like Bones and Night. But then you have your prose poems.
Mhm.
How did those come about?
I first started writing primarily in lines. The prose poems, I first started thinking about prose poems when I was at Indiana, just from being exposed to this. Because again, I didn't come from a place where I hung out with artists and poets and stuff like that. You know, I just wasn't exposed to that sort of thing. And so by reading other people's work, and there was one particular poet, another student at Indiana that had really influenced my writing a lot in my work. His name is Justin Petropoulos, and he had these really cool-looking, neat little box prose poems, and just they were very tight-looking. Though he would push the left and right margin in, so it actually looked like little boxes. But the work or the subject matter that he was talking about was just it was languagey to some extent, avant-garde, and it was just really experimental and really chaotic. But it was all held together by this tight box form, and I think that I was drawn to that. And again,
So you
it's a
got some
visual
sort of aesthetic pleasure
Mhm.
from that tension.
Yeah, and that's what it is. It is primarily an aesthetic thing. Although I would say that there's a couple of poems that I wrote. One was in the chapbook called "While Late Capitalism," which it's about people being stuck, confined within a box, within the back of a semi truck inside of a rig. And so I wanted the poem to have the feeling of being compressed and without space and without air. So that's why I ran it all together like that.
I'm glad you brought that poem up, because for me it was one of the poems where you really do seem to place your reader inside that space. And I'm wondering if you can comment about where that poem came from, whether it was from what was the source of that poem. And I'm also wondering if you can talk a little bit about the device that you use of the brackets, the dashes, and suppressing what I think are sometimes some vowels.
Mhm. The poem was triggered by there's a part of me also as a Chicago poet, I almost feel reluctant to write because to me it's almost as if I could see other people saying, well, that's more of a border issue, and there's people who have spent their lives growing up on the border or thinking about the border, and a lot of their work revolves around that idea. So that was triggered primarily just from hearing about so many stories of human beings being brought over in the back of trucks and just smuggled into the country. And I'm very much interested in the idea of capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
But I can't just write about capitalism because it's this big abstract thing. It doesn't mean anyone to anyone. So I try to map it or anchor it in concrete scenarios and situations. So that particular poem, again, I wanted the form of the poem to mimic and to imitate and to parallel the experience that the people were going through as they were in there. They were without oxygen. It was hot. That's why I ran all the words together, because I wanted the reader to try and get a sense of lack of air and lack of breath. So that's why I wanted compression was the main objective in that
So
poem.
is that also the reason? So the missing vowels, is that the lack of air,
Mhm.
lack of ease and eyes?
Yes.
Ah,
Mhm.
okay.
Yes.
All right.
Although it was hard to format. I wanted it to be a perfect box or rectangle, but it's
And what
hard to
about the
format.
actual details itself? I mean, it sounds like the person who wrote this either read some sort of eyewitness account of being in one of those vehicles that
Mhm.
that transports people, where even suggest that sometimes people even die
Mhm.
during the journey. Where did you get the actual material?
That's a poem that has obviously nothing to do with personal experience. That's one of the poems in there that simply came from reading news documents, from reading and kind of taking this particular fact from this news story, this one here, and kind of putting them together, whatever fit best for the poem, whatever worked best for the particular poem. So
You brought up another very interesting point, and I'm glad you said this. So this is a poem that, in essence, is not tied to your biography per se.
Mhm.
It's a poem that you researched in many ways.
Mhm.
And then there are some other poems in Pepper Spray with the first person I, which do suggest that they might be based on autobiographical material. Can you talk a little bit about your process of writing one type of poem that is born from your own experience, and the poem like While Late Capitalism, which is something divorced from your experience but requires research? Is the work method for both of those poems similar, different?
When I was studying at Chicago, I wrote this, for my BA thesis, as I mentioned earlier, this collection, this cycle of poems that was extremely, extremely personal. Every single poem in there was directly about me. And it almost felt like, as I think all writers do, I have a lot of anxieties and concerns about my writing, and one of the ones that have been placed on me is the idea that certain Latino poets are a little bit too confessional or too autobiographical. I wouldn't say that I'm trying to get away with it, but I was consciously trying to write about other things. Although, as a Latino writer, as a Chicano writer, I should say, that is a poem that...
The box poem.
The capitalism poem is a poem that is of, I think, immediate concern to all Chicanos, because even though I didn't grow up on the border, I'm a third or fourth generation Chicano and born and raised in the United States in my family. That's still, I feel that those experiences are part of my community, this larger community that I feel that I belong to. Some of the other, you asked about point of view. A lot of times it depends on the poem. If I feel the poem would work better in the third person point of view, it might be about me, but I might be writing about it in the third person point of view. Then I'll write it that way. But sometimes that might get a little bit confusing. Like if pronouns aren't working properly, sometimes it just makes more sense for the reader to put it in the first person point of view. And I'm not necessarily that interested in, if the narrative gets lost, and I'm not interested in just having a linear narrative all the time. Like, I like the idea of confusing the reader, but there are some poems where it just has to be that way. It's just more of a gut feeling.
Could you share a little bit, if you're comfortable, sharing the role of, looking at the cover of Pepper Spray, which, as you know, was created by an artist who read the manuscript. He puts on the cover 2 police officers, which seems to suggest that the issue of, well, let's just come out and say it, police brutality or abuse of police authority, at least for this visual artist, did seem to have a role in his imagination. And it does seem to have a role in the first part of the chapbook. Could you talk a little bit about those poems and what was the source of those poems?
I mentioned earlier that I'm really interested in the idea of capitalism, and as a subset of that, I'm really interested in power, writing about power dynamics. And there's a lot of situations in which, or a lot of subject matter where you could write under that theme, under that rubric of power. But a lot of those poems deal with, as I mentioned before, I've been in situations, primarily when I was a lot younger, where I might have been with other young kids, young boys of color, and just the idea of being in a certain neighborhood. This has happened to me several times, where just driving around or being with a group of kids that look like myself, and being stopped and being questioned and being pulled over, which a lot of those, again, come from earlier experiences. As I've gotten older, as my mother says, I've turned into a little bit of I've gotten yuppified, I don't dress like a thug, and I used to wear baggy clothes and kind of thug it out, and but now, so it's partly, I guess, not only were they doing racial profiling, but class profiling as well, so yeah, a lot of them stem from that, or from experiences that have happened to close friends of mine who might say, man, you know what happened to me today? Some cop did this, and that. But the interesting thing is, and I don't know if this has to do with academics or what, but they might tell, as I went away to school, went away to college, and got educated, they would tell me things that happened to them, because a lot of my friends that I grew up with didn't go to college. They just,
Yeah.
and they would say something that happened to them, and I would hear their story, and I would get really upset and really pissed off and really angry, and I'd be like, what did you do about it? And they're like, that's just the way it is. So the interesting thing about it is that I'm probably more upset about those things than they are, and it's still happening to them, and I don't really experience it that much at all. Nothing
And-
as intense as what used to be and what they're going through.
And then you take their experience and shape it into a work of art?
Yeah, which is a kind of appropriation, which something that I wonder about.
Have any of these people read the poems
Mhm.
themselves?
Yeah, I've showed the poems to a lot of people, and they like them. They think they're pretty cool, and they're like, yeah, this is when this, I know what this poem was about. So,
Have you ever given poems to them almost as if you'd like their feedback? Am I getting this right? Does this sound right to you? Or-
sometimes I have, yeah. But it's interesting, or as weird as it might sound, since I guess I'm partly maybe an academic poet, like I'm very concerned about revision. I don't just write any old poem. So as much as I'm concerned about the feedback from other trained academic poets, it's actually a lot more, it means a lot more to me. Like when I handed that chapbook to some old friends of mine and they read it and I got their approval, so to speak, it meant a lot to me, because I would never say that I'm speaking for them. I can't do that.
Mhm.
And I would never say that I'm their voice because they have their own voice. I don't believe in that idea of,
Yeah.
well, I'm going to try to give a voice to these people,
Mhm.
because that's really problematic. That's not what I'm trying to do. But I guess what I'm trying to do is bring different subject matter to mainstream poetry that isn't really talked about a lot.
Mhm.
And sometimes I feel like I'm writing about cliche things. I mean, how many times has a Mexican kid been roughed up by the cops? It happens all the time. But that doesn't mean that we should stop writing about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Having said that, though, if I'm recalling correctly, something you said a while back, where do you see your work going post Pepper Spray? Do you see doing some of the same stuff as you work towards a full-length manuscript? Well, maybe another way of putting this, because maybe this will continue to be a core of a full-length manuscript. Where do you see your work going, or where would you like to see your work going, say, in a hypothetical second full-length manuscript? Or is that even a fair question? Because it depends on what your life circumstances are and what's happening in the world and to you.
It's a fair question. That's something that I've been thinking about a lot. And again, now that I'm sitting here talking about these things, I'm realizing that Kevin Young had a bigger influence on me than I realized before. But Kevin Young always seems to write a lot. He has projects. He doesn't just write a bunch of poems and then let them find their own relationship to one another. He will sit down, and he had his Jelly Roll book, which is all about blues in general. It was a blues book. Then he had his most recent one is Black Mariah, which is about film noir. So all of those poems are about that. So I like the idea of writing with a project. Like I have some loose idea or general ideas in my head. A lot of the poems that were in there in Pepper Spray, it's sort of an amalgam of all these different things that I was just kind of going, and I tried to put what I felt were poems that complemented one another. A poet that I really admire and who's a book that I really like is Spring Comes to Chicago by Campbell McGrath.
Mm-hmm.
And he has this big, huge poem in there called the Bob Hope poem. And he deals with, it's quirky, but it's also very intelligent and he'll send you to your dictionary and send you to your, looking up your, he name drops a lot. And so I like what he's doing, and he talks about capitalism, and again, he tries to put it in concrete manifestations of it. So I guess what I really want to do, and I've been looking lately for Walmart poems, and
Poems?
I'm sure that, and I know that people have been writing about them, but that's sort of where my head is at right now. I want to write about Walmart, and not necessarily, again, to get up on a soapbox and start preaching about it, but it's it's a crazy, crazy
Well,
social experience just to walk into a Walmart, just the idea, the concept of it, the way it affects everyone and the way everyone's drawn to it. And
the workers.
the work, yeah. So I want to write more about.
So Walmart might be a vehicle from which to write about other things that you're
Yeah,
concerned about.
yeah, exactly. Because if you want Walmart, you can just you throw that out as a trigger, and you can go in so many directions with that particular topic.
You mentioned Campbell McGrath. How did you come to Campbell McGrath? It's not an obvious association I would have
Mhm.
with you.
Well, he's a University of Chicago alum,
Oh, he is.
and I didn't know that when I was there at all. But a person who I met at Indiana, another student there, had studied under Campbell McGrath in Miami because Campbell McGrath teaches at Florida International
And
University.
Campbell McGrath was one of the principal mentors of Richard Blanco, the Cuban American.
Yeah,
poet.
yeah.
So there's a connection there as far as Latino poetry.
Yeah. So I was turned again through a friend, turned me on to Campbell McGrath, and then I was like, he's talking about all this Chicago stuff and University of Chicago, and it's like I know all these references that he's making, and it's very heady, and I think a lot of, at least in circles of people that I would know, would find it a little bit too, I don't know, academic, but I can appreciate where he's coming from and what he's trying to do, and it's just such a huge project that I think he worked on it for like 10 years or whatever, this one poem.
And what's the name of the book again? Spring Comes to Chicago?
Spring Comes to Chicago.
Okay. So by reading that, did that lead you to read some of his other books?
Yeah, I read, he has a book that just came out sort of recently, which I haven't read, for financial reasons actually, because you can't just go into the library and get a Campbell McGrath book. You have to order it, but he has a book called Florida Poems. I guess that's once he moved down to Florida. So I just think he does a lot of really interesting things with capitalism, and he anchors himself in it. He knows that he's very much a product of a capitalist, consumer-driven culture, and yet he's also poking fun at it and showing how absurd it is and how much it consumes our lives and how horrifying it is at the same time. So I really like the way he situates the speaker of those poems amongst these very political, very heated issues.
So hearing you talk about him makes me think that in some ways he has provided sort of a model, a scaffolding, a blueprint, a template for what you want to do next, but maybe with different content.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's a poet that I really admire, and I guess I hate to use the word accessible because I don't know what that means. That's a very charged, loaded word, but I would like to write about those things, but make them accessible so that someone who hasn't read Capital cover to cover by Marx, or someone who hasn't read Foucault can get something out of the poems, because he references those thinkers a lot in his work, and you need a advanced degree sometimes to decipher his poems.
Okay. Before I ask you to read a couple of poems, I'm going to ask you this last comment/question to sort of wind things down. Oftentimes we hear the word community and community of writers, and yet writing and reading can be a really solitary activity. How have you viewed yourself over time with relation to these terms, and does it make a difference to the writing itself, or is its function for something else? Community of writers.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I feel as I've been writing, especially now that I've went back to Chicago and I'm not in an MFA program, I'm not in any regular workshops or anything like that, it is a very isolating thing, and I don't hang out with a bunch of artists, and my poet friends are spread out around the country. When I come to events like this and see people again, that's about the extent of it. I wish that I saw these people more, but to be serious, to be quite honest, the first time when I really felt that I was part of a community was at the Austin AWP, because I saw that there were all these other Latino, or whatever they want to call themselves, writers that were sort of doing their thing, and knowing that they were coming from all over the country, and I feel now that I'm part of this, I don't know, do I call it a movement or whatever, but there's this next generation.
But there's something there that wasn't there before.
There's something there that wasn't there before, like just people who I didn't know of. Even in my own city, I've met several poets, several people, been turned on to people just going to
like Brenda, for example.
Like Brenda.
Yeah.
I just recently met this. I mentioned to you this fabulous poet, Jacob
Yeah.
Signs. I had a reading very recently. So, yeah, there is. I always felt like I was on the outside. Like there were these mainstream poets who were hogging all of the journals, all the lit mags, and they were deciding they were going to be they were the gatekeepers if I was going to be let in or not. But now I don't feel that way. I feel like they're doing their thing and we're doing our thing. You know, I don't need their approval or their to open the door. I mean, I don't feel as antagonistic about it anymore either. Like I just, I'm in a place. Back in Chicago. I feel a lot more. That's my home. You know, that's where I'm from. So I don't have this I don't have this guard up, this defense thing going anymore with regards to my views on poetry. So I feel in a lot better place now.
I'd like to wind down, speaking of Chicago, by asking you to read, for this interview, to close it, I'd like you to read 2 poems. One is very short, How to Hear Chicago, and I'd like you to read Bones.
Okay.
And you can say a little bit about it. I mean, that's it.
Okay. How to Hear Chicago actually was triggered by, I went to a poetry reading by a poet by the name of Mark Turcotte. He came to my school at Triton College to give a reading, and he was giving the introduction to one of his poems, and I guess he had lived in Chicago for a little while, and then he moved to Wisconsin, somewhere, a more rural area, and he had talked about how people were telling him, you got to get out of Chicago because you can't hear the spirits there. And so I was like, that gave me that idea. Okay. And it's also sort of a dedication to, it comes right in the book, it comes right after another poem, which is about someone kind of not, I mean, I write about brutality and those issues of power, and sometimes it might come off as a little bit accusatory, but there are certain things that people I know do that sometimes we bring it on ourselves too. So it's always this, it's complex. It's not a simple like, oh, the popo's coming down on me, you know. I mean, it's a two-way thing, which is another thing I want to try to write more about, but I don't personally know any cops to interview. Okay. Although I live next to a Chicago cop now, which is ironic. All right. How to Hear Chicago. Here a spirit must yell to be heard, yet a bullet need only whisper to make its point. Sometimes I imagine you right before your death with an entire city in your ears.
Now Bones.
Bones I actually wrote for my mother. My mother's worked in grocery stores her entire life, and my father as well. So that means hours and hours and hours of being on her feet. You know, she worked as a bagger, as a cashier. Now she works in the bakery department, the bakery area. Okay. And she had to have surgery on her foot because of too much standing. Okay. Her bones were all jacked up. Bones. Your feet are a slow train wreck of cuneiforms and metatarsals fallen off track. Too many overtimes, standing, bagging melon and meat, frozen peas and 6-packs wedged careful against egg cartons, loaves of bread, tomatoes that piss if touched too hard. At home, you stand at the sink full of yesterday's plates, sauce-caked pots, butter knives tough with peanut butter. Tonight, you fall asleep in a chair trying to ignore the 52 bones of your feet, each one humming its own pain.